civil rights movement was a series of political worldwide movements for equality between all races. The members of the movement fought to ensure that the rights of the people are equally protected by the law. It's hard to say when the civil rights movement really started and what sparked the revolution. Some attribute the spark to the Second World War, when African Americans filled the job openings of white soldiers, only to be removed when the war ended. This, in some ways, led to the Executive Order 9981, which declared all races should receive equal treatment. Yet this one document did not satisfy the civil rights activists in America because racism and inequality continued to flood the streets of the nation. For a few years, the fight for justice fell down, until one brave young African American girl and her family decided to stand up for their rights and demand fair treatment. This demand came in the form of the case Brown versus Board of Education, as the Brown family urged for equal rights to education. Previously, the separate but equal idea had been in place, but unfortunately, while the institutions were surely separate, they strayed far from equal. With the aid of the legendary lawyer Thurgood Marshall, Brown won the case and successfully, through heavy discrimination, attended a formerly all-white school. In addition to this victory, Thurgood Marshall won over 30 more Supreme Court cases during the Civil Rights Movement and helped monumentally in the judicial sense. After 3 years of small movements and formations of civil rights activist groups, one of the biggest events and largest sparks to the entire movement occurred when Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus for a white man. Her arrest excited other major players such as the main leader of the movement, Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King was the definite leader of the civil rights movement, leading countless rallies and events. He influenced many Americans of both races to join the revolution. One group he strongly influenced was Little Rock 9, a group of 9 teenagers that insisted on attending an all-white high school. Despite the Brown vs. Board case, many schools still restricted African American attendance, making the effort to attend the school a difficult one. Again, like Brown, these kids attending the school through heavy discrimination and with the aid of the National Guard.
Martin Luther King proceeded to lead more rallies, even after his arrest for protesting in 1963. Just months after his abbreviated jail time, King delivered one of the most famous speeches of all time, the I Have a Dream speech, during the March on Washington. This speech inspired and influenced even more Americans to support his cause. The rally and speech put pressure on the Kennedy administration to advance civil rights legislation in Congress. This showed, as just 1 year later, Lyndon B. Johnson signed and approved the Civil Rights Act, the most sweeping civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. This act outlawed any type of discrimination. This, although not actually ending the movement, acted as a huge win for the activists. The next big rally happened in Selma, Alabama, the march that Marv Zimmerman attended. Thousands of activists nonviolently marched, only to be attacked by policemen.
And marching in Selma was a way for us to show that it was time for people other than white people to be equal in this country. And that's what we did. And we were frightened, we were nervous, we were anxious. During the course of the march, there was a lot of shooting. Some people got killed. And it was one of the highlights of my life.
145 years we waited a long time for freedom. We are trying to remind the nation of the urgency of the moment. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to transform Alabama, the heart of Dixie, to a state with a heart for brotherhood and peace and goodwill. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children.
Then, just 3 years later, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. The movement suffered a huge loss in his death, but the activists kept fighting and continue fighting to this day. The movement surely increased awareness of racism, as well as improving the situation immensely, yet a plethora of issues still exist today. Today, not only African Americans, but many other groups including women, Hispanics, Asian Americans, people with disabilities, homosexuals, and other minorities wage civil rights campaigns. This struggle continues for these groups, especially for African Americans, in terms of housing, education, and politics. What current issues present themselves with racism and unequal rights currently?
The first one that comes to my mind is gentrification, which is basically putting these poor minority groups and huddling them into these inner city neighborhoods and basically neglecting them and saying, you basically have no future and we're not going to pay attention to you. A lot of the education system works in favor of white people and works against these poor minority groups, and that's not fair. So I think as we move further in our country's history, we have to make sure that when we say equal opportunity, we really mean it, and we aren't neglecting these people who we are writing off as being poor and are not going to contribute to society.
What are some current issues that present themselves with racism and unequal rights currently?
So even though we all understand that laws might say one thing, the interpretation of those laws and the practice of different practices in different sectors of our society will still keep things unequal.
Other problems, although not purely factual and statistical, comes from everyday racism from policemen, courthouses, and many other institutions.
The government and many organizations constantly and justifiably attempt to improve the situation with racism and unequal rights. Another legislation that proves the remnants of the civil rights movement is the recent renewal of both the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Act, a law that permitted voting to all American citizens regardless of race. Unfortunately, the decision was not unanimous, displaying that some discrimination still clearly exists. In general, many programs and organizations help address the problem that civil rights movement made notable so many years ago.
Well, it's a very interesting question because there's obviously discrimination against African Americans today, and I personally don't think they get equal opportunity, mainly because there's still this group of people living in poverty and their rights really aren't being addressed and they aren't getting equal opportunities. But I think the civil rights movement was very effective.
No. But with any social movement, I believe that there is some improvement. It's like stretching a rubber band. So without the movement, things stay the same. But with the movement, what happens is people's perspectives change. People get more strength, and things will never go back to what they were, hopefully. But I think there's still a lot more work to be done.
I remember a time, we have a black foster son. He dated a white girl. He had to bring her to our house because he's now 65 years old. This is 45 years ago. You couldn't do it. I brought him to our swimming pool. They called the police. That was 50 years ago. Well, that can't happen today. So in that sense, there's progress. But there's not nearly the progress there should be.
The civil rights movement helped America take great strides toward equality, but there is still a lot of work to be done.